Mic test is mic test.
It doesn't matter which is a better angle.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for taking the time out today to attend our talk on valuing homemakers. So I think we will agree that homemakers and housework play a very important role for families, for society, and even in the economy. However, also the problem is that the value of homemakers and their work is not as valued as highly as paid employment per se. So how do we put a value to that? How do we measure household production and to ensure that homemakers also receive the same value and appreciation as paid work? We are very honored to have with us here today Professor Euston Quah to talk about household production measurements and valuing homemakers. Professor Quah is Albert Wisemius Chair Professor of Economics at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, as well as Director of the Economic Growth Center. Throughout his career, Professor Quah has been in various leadership and advisory positions of important national and international public and private bodies, including internationally acclaimed organizations such as the Asian Development Bank and the Overseas Development Institute of London. A prolific and well-cited writer, Professor Quah is well published in academia and the general media. Professor Quah is currently a distinguished fellow at Penang Institute and has served as an external economics reviewer at established Malaysian universities such as University of Science Malaysia. Professor Quah, may I invite you on stage, and the floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to see friends here. I'm happy to see uh, attendees from previous past talks. You know, this is my times here in Penang City already. In fact, going back all the way when it was called Surrey Penang, I gave a talk here at the time as well. So I'm well acquainted with this institute. Also, many of you would know this is my hometown. So I'm always very happy whenever I come here for holidays. I will combine that with giving a talk at the Penang Institute or visiting the USM. And I'm happy to note that a few USM faculty is here this afternoon. So um, good to see you, colleagues here as well. uh, Now, by the way, this talk, many of you may think it's a very sensitive talk and so on about women. It's about homemakers. It's about home production. It's about what we do at home, whether it's done by a male or a female spouse. So what I want to do today is actually to tell you the literature on home production. I call it home production. It's a production that takes place in the home. Many of you may not know that I started my career actually writing a lot on home production, which seems strange, but it's not strange. Why? It's about valuing something which is not easily valued. They don't have ready market prices, and so one has to impute these market prices for the home. And I've started on this career because of my interest on valuation issues. So I study cost-benefit analysis. I study environmental economics. But with these two subjects in economics, um, we always have to do valuation because the environment is also non-market. How do you value clean air, clean water, and so on and so forth? And so it has to do with the idea of valuation of non-market goods. And home production, which is production that takes place at home, is also a kind of a non-market good. So that piqued my interest. And the harder it is to, to, to value something, I would love to take up that challenge, right? So in the sense that I've been successful in getting my papers published in this area, and you will see later on that much of my work has been also published, also selected by the UK Critical Writings in Economics. Now, I have a lot of slides. I'm not going to use all my slides. I'm not going to be in detail. Sufficient for this audience to understand some key messages to take away from. Okay. I just do this. So here is you see, it goes way back in 1986, and I published an article for the public, which is what is the value of a wife. But here I make it very careful that you can't value really wives per se, but you're valuing wives' contribution to the family, and that is what is important, and that's one neglected. So I went through the literature here in '86, and the Straits Times picked up my work later on in other years, uh, going up to the 2000 something, right? So I think it's of sufficient interest to a lot of the laymen and the public on this. But it's not something just for show and interest. It has important ramifications, implications for GDP, for divorce, for wrongful death or injury. Anything that involves contribution by homemakers and that is lost is because of these things. Right? So here gives you a list of all the people in the past who have said the importance of household work valuation, beginning with Wesley Mitchell back in 1921. Then the famous economist Alfred Marshall. You see some interesting quotes that I pick up from there. A woman who makes her own clothes, or a man who digs his own garden or repairs his own house is earning income, just as would the dressmaker, the gardener, the carpenter who might be hired to do. Then Arthur Pigou at Cambridge. Arthur Pigou is famous for his work on income distribution as well as on pollution issues. In fact, what we see today and hear today about carbon taxes all came from Arthur Pigou. And latest was 210 in the little book by the Nobel laureate Stiglitz and another laureate Amita Sen, Petoshi, mismeasuring our lives, where they did a large part of the book on this idea, household protection. So I'm going to talk about why there's a demand for measuring household production evaluation, and why is there a resistance to such measures? Lots of definition about household production, but we all agree household production means things produced at home, all right? Cooking, cleaning, washing, drying, dishes, taking care of children, driving them to school, all these are household. And the famous quote from the Nobel laureate Gary Becker in 1965 basically talks about households combining the time and the market goods to produce basic commodities that directly enter into the household's utility functions. It means their satisfaction, and so on and so forth. I won't go through every definition. Now let's look at the several reasons why there was a demand for measurement. One is household production, according to many studies, is a large component of economic growth. And it's not much different from goods and services which you can find in the market. Therefore, it is inconsistent if you look at national income accounting. Those of us are very familiar with GDP, GNP. How do you include things into the GDP? It is just the market goods that multiplied by their respective market prices. So it's a sum of P times Q, price times quantity, right? So it is inconsistent in national income to include owner occupied housing. So if you didn't rent a place, you occupy, they'll do an imputation on the rental values which you fetched. And that is imputed in the GDP. Also, the farmers self-produce crops for food consumption, which are also included, but somehow household production is left out. The other thing is that over time, there is already large improvements of data availability, and Housework also has become quite commercialized, right? You get people to do your work for you. You can uh, go in, people supply this work to your household. It's commercialized. And of course, in the academic literature, significant advances in what we call the new home economics, looks at studies about the time and money into producing the home goods. And there's a whole picture on it as well. It's also useful to study household production to provide social welfare indication. Uh, and looking at comparisons between one economy and another economy. So high growth rates in the GNP may be actually quite useful because it could just be a transfer of people from the household sector to the market sector. Or the reverse could also be true. In times of recession, people move out from the market work because they get very low wage, find work, they just move back to the housework and contribute there. So it's a transfer here, transfer there. So if you don't do estimation and valuation of household production, you're going to get this misleading. So we think the GNP is very high, very good, but actually people coming back to work, and therefore the GNP goes up, and so on and so forth. And it's also provides useful guidelines for policymakers and government to study labor force participation rates. How do you influence labor force participation? It's through the homemakers. You can influence them to try to encourage them either to enter the market or to leave the market. So they found that married women, for example, working outside the home, they tend to react negatively to higher levels of taxation by reducing the paid hours and increasing times devoted to home production. And so on. As I said, I won't deal with every. And demands of measurement also because we want to recognize the economic contribution of women in households and into society. Otherwise, the policies would neglect the importance of women in the economy. Also, thinking about this estimation of how much they contribute. You see this study in 2020, 10.8 trillion across 2 countries. That's a huge amount. And the International Labour Office estimates that the unpaid care and domestic work by a country is valued between 10 to 39% of the GDP and 15% GDP across all OECD countries. It is important, as I said, for applications in court, what is in law, for wrongful death and wrongful injury, and it's useful for cost benefit analysis. Now, applications in family law and gender equality. So, you know, if a woman or homemaker, let's put it homemaker, some people say, "Oh, why should housework? You keep talking about housework and women." It's not necessarily so. I'm just talking about homemaking, but statistics and surveys do show that 80-90% of all the work is usually done by women still today over many years. And so to me, that's an important component. So if a woman marries this man and the man accumulates all the assets in his own name, and then the woman doesn't get anything, and there was a Canadian back in the 80s where the Supreme Court eventually awarded very minimal to them because they cannot find women's name in all the assets. And so they became very alarming. And so the people objected, even the judges themselves, but they were tied to the what is in law, right? So after because of the case where women get practically almost nothing after many years of marriage to the man, because none of the assets are his name, he only contributed also production and taking care of children, right? So you would think that is very important. By that time, the law doesn't take that into account, and they only count what is accumulated assets in the marriage in whose name. And so the law changed to become a 50-50 rule. And one time Singapore also went to the 50-50 rule. Now it's easier to divide the matrimonial assets into upon divorce, right? But in recent years, there's a reversal again. because the 50-50 rule may work against the spouse. And so some people will just marry in a few years and then they get the 50% of that. And so the decision or most of the court jurisdictions these days are working on the relative contribution of the male and female spouses to the family. So that means they will have to compute, they have to estimate what's the value of the homemaking done by the homemaker contribution to the family. So that's important. And I also said that if you get killed on the road, if you're a homemaker, then there is a loss of all the household production activities that you do for the family. That's a real loss. So there's a welfare loss to the family. So you therefore value this loss in terms of the lost home production. So that's another reason why we want to estimate home production. Of course, we want to promote more less gender biased attitudes. Okay, let's skip this. Now this one, this Singapore case, it was published in 2021. Why a housewife's contributions can be worth millions of dollars. That's actually a legal case, and in a matrimonial division of assets. So here, from 1 to 5 is the step by step for calculating how much each spouse contribution in the family. Right? In Madras, in India, right, also about women who is a homemaker is entitled to equal share in property, regardless whether it was purchased, and the reason they gave is through home production. And the BBC has an article about how India calculates the value of this work by using opportunity cost. We'll talk about the methods later, but just to show you the relevance that this kind of work does lead to actual application. These are different countries. In Spain, in China, in India, it's all about the same thing, that the judicial outcomes influenced by the value for household production. Okay, so all these numbers is not plucked from the air, but there were some methods used to calculate for these values. What Malaysian politicians said about value makers. I thought since I'm here, I would then try to search out what some of these politicians would say about that. See, from Penang, Chong Eng, Penang State Executive Councillor, need to recognize the economic value of housewives, promote gender equality. Dr. Sri Anwar Ibrahim, the current Prime Minister, at that time the PKR President, talks about so to my brothers, apart from gardening, please clean your house. Maybe tomorrow we can take a damp cloth and wipe, not the wife, but the husband, encouraging the husband to do the work. Husband and wife are a team. And the wife of Dato Sri Anwar Ibrahim, all around the world, women are laden with all this double burden, and women participate equally in paid employment, but spend a large portion of their time in unpaid work. So she did something. Actually, she promoted the Malaysian scheme to protect homemaking. This is a scheme, the Social Security scheme found in Malaysia. In Singapore, we don't have this scheme, but so this is a recognition for homemakers. Even though the amount may be quite small, but still it's a start. Right? Yeah. Okay, I won't go through all this, but the state is recommending 600 ringgit monthly. Still very small, but I think the husband was asked to pay something like 100, 120. Right, to the scheme. Some statistics, well, you can see that females form a majority of the countries in Asia and Africa to do disproportionately more unpaid care, domestic work compared to men. Allow me to sit. And in Africa, in West Asia, the women, again, statistics show that they spend a lot of time in homemaking relative to men. And people in Belgium spend the least time in homemaking activities. Now I'm going to just show you quickly some of the statistics relevant to home production. In the case of Malaysia, now, what's the reason that Malaysian women do not participate in the labor force? So according to the surveys and statistics done, in fact, they attribute that taking care of old people in the home and housework demands their attention of time. And there is also indication of the gradual shift of the gender norms. The share of women citing housework as a reason for not working has actually gradually declined, while schooling as a reason increased. Naturally, if the people who perform in homemaking, right, are mainly women, and if women's education goes up, the participation in school, becoming graduates and so on, naturally it becomes an opportunity cost of time if you stay at home relative to working outside. And so there is a compelling reason, there's an attraction for them to leave the home sector and go to the market sector. Okay, so let's go. Same thing. Why are they absent from work? In the Malaysian statistics show that family responsibilities was a common identified reason. Now in Singapore, not much difference, right? Not much difference. There are most females cite again housework and caregiving duties reasons for not working compared to men, regardless of educational qualifications, marital status, and work experience. And the thing that is also noted is that the longer a woman stays outside the labor force, the more likely she's going to cite homemaking as a reason because they have been too long out of working. And so it suggests that there is a market, there's depreciation of her skills if she entered the market. And therefore, perhaps it is better she stays at home to contribute at home. Activity is higher than if you were to go to the labor market. There was a big study done in Singapore called the unpaid work titled. This was done by a group, United with Singapore and Ipsos. So in the study, they revealed a few things in the case of Singapore. You can read some of these findings. I mean, the bottom line is that women takes on the hard work. Whether they are in paid work or not, still women takes up the bulk of the chores, home care. Now, COVID is something that quite interesting because when we had the COVID, there was the lockdown, right? And, in the lockdown, you see that more people were asked to stay at home. What does it mean? It means that a lot of more home production will take place. And it also means that the man's spouse who does a less share of house before COVID now gets to see the woman's spouse doing a lot of home activity firsthand for what, waking hours, 24 hours a day. And so this brings about a greater awareness and appreciation of people, of their lives working at home. The other thing is that while the value of home production may go up, right, there's a problem. The problem is that um, for many households still, there is a less clear between paid work and unpaid work, paid and unpaid, because the woman's spouse are now doing multitasking, taking care of the family at home, which she used to do a lot, and then she takes the home back from the market work to the homework, to stay at home to work, called work at home, right? So there's the lines between market work and homework become a blur for this, and then they just become extra burden for the woman. So things happens in COVID. The question that's posed here is, would this involuntary increase in time spent in household during COVID-19 exacerbate or elevate gender inequality? So argument is that it will lead to more equitable allocation of housework and childcare among both spouses, accompanied by less biased gender attitudes towards household members in Japan. This was done by a study in 2021 by Hara and Kakuchi. And this is the part I was talking about. Another study by Chauhan says that despite all these flexible working arrangements, convergence of employment and household responsibilities means it's harder in the case of employed women in India to draw the line between paid and unpaid work. Right? Now, this is quite interesting, which we found interesting from the perspective of how the official this ministry, and that led a lot of social media talking about, and they put up a poster that says, if your spouse does something that you do not like, don't nag him. Use humor and tell him, this is the way you hang the clothes, my darling, and so on and so forth. And this is put up by Malaysia's Women and Family Development Ministry. What does that tell you? It tells Minister, okay, it reinforces the gender bias, isn't it? Okay, so we know there are various demands as the reason why we need to measure and value household production. Now let's look at the reasons why there was a resistance to measure and value household production. One is scarcity of data. Why? Because there's no records, You cannot just open up a bank book. There's no records how much is produced, nor is the time that is devoted to providing such services. So it's a non-market activity with no observable prices. So it's hard. When I talk about value and measurement, there's no record, right? So that's all. And then the definitional issue I said earlier. What constitutes household work? If you take a child for a walk in the park, is it childcare or is it leisure? Some may say it's leisure, some may say childcare, multitasking. My point is, if you are not clear as to what defines household production, then you cannot measure, you cannot collect the data because everybody will interpret the data differently. So that raises a lot of problems. Then the problem of aggregation. And as I told you, there's a joint production issue here because of multitasking. So which is which? Do you add time for cooking plus the time for taking care of the children simultaneously? Right? Do you double up the time? How do you do it? So these again questions. And diminishing returns to labor with more and more time spent on housework will not yield the same amount of output as produced before. And differences in the time sensitivity of household chores between men and women. Tasks like household repair work, management of tech devices are of lower frequency and more easily postponed compared to tasks like cooking, laundry, and caregiving, which is more immediate and daily. And of course, improvements in household technology over time distort the time inputs of household production activities. For example, time spent on washing clothes is lesser today because the washing machine is on, but does not that does not mean that less clean clothes are produced by households today. So technology confounds and confuses the issue. And then the method of valuation. There are several methods which I'll go through soon. Do we talk about what they produce as the goods, or do we measure the inputs, meaning time they spend to produce the goods? So do you talk about the clean floor? or do you talk about the time taken to clean the floor? Because it varies between the two methods. So which method produces also the most meaningful and consistent set of estimates of economic values of household work that is also consistent with the way income accountants measure market goods and services? So if you want to value housework to augment the GDP or GNP, then you must always be consistent in the methodology used to value housework that is consistent with the way the GNP statistics are collected and measured. If you use your own method or method which is different from the way income accountants do it for GDP, then how can you say this is for GDP? It must be the same way the GDP income statistics are derived. Okay, now let's move on to valuation. How do you value housework? So one method is called the output valuation method. You produce several home goods like cooked food, clean floor, clean clothes, dried, ironed out clothes. These things have market equivalent, right? Market equivalent, and you can go to the market and get these things done, right? Then you can add these things. But the problem with this output valuation method is that it is horrendous because the homemaker does so many types of activities. Some don't find market equivalent directly. So what you do? So it becomes very problematic, right? It's not so easy. Now, this method called the replacement cost method is very common. It's used by a lot of studies. And this comprises of basically two main. You just find out how much it would take to replace the homemaker. So there are two versions. One is we hire a maid. So the maid can do cooking, cleaning, and so on and so forth. All right. So the idea is to find out what it would cost to replace all this with the maid. However, we also note that the maid doesn't do everything. Things, for example, parents teaching the children, not all the way to university, secondary school, but definitely kindergarten, nursery, and primary school, right? So the homemaker parent usually will spend time with their children going through these things. But the maid, and so if you use the replacement cost method by multiplying by taking the cost to replace these activities with the maid, you would have underestimated because of these other things that the maid doesn't do. Another thing the maid doesn't do is to plan household budgets, which the homemaker does. A lot of planning is done by the homemaker. The maid doesn't take it upon herself to do all this planning. So again, if you take the maid to replace, there will be a shortfall. Right? Now, to remedy this, researchers came up with a second method, which we call replacement cost by specialized function. So what does that do? It means that first you have to find out what kind of activities the homemaker does. As I said, cooking is one, taking the children to school is another one, cook, clean floor another one, and so on. So now for each one of these number of hours spent in these activities, you go and find out the market equivalent. So cooking can be done by a cook. Find out the wages per hour of a cook, multiply by the number of hours the homemaker does to cook. Driving the children to school, find out how much a driver charges per hour, multiply by the number of times the parent takes the child to school. Cleaning, you can also find out what a professional cleaner does. So the replacement cost by specialized function then adds up all the using this market equivalent values, right? Adds up everything to get the value of the home. The problem with this approach is that we know that homemakers are not specialists. They are mostly generalists, most homemakers. So if you go and take all the specialized wages of market equivalents, you're going to overestimate the value of homemaking. So that's a problem with this method. Now, then I came out myself with called the hybrid model. And also another model is called the efficiency adjusted replacement cost. Now, so what do I do? It's just common sense, right? Very simple. First, you say replacement cost by maid insufficient. Then you say the replacement cost by specialized function overestimate. So the idea is that first to recognize that yes, most of the work done by the homemaker is a generalist kind, the cooking, the washing, the cleaning, and this can be replaced by a maid's cost. Okay. Then the missing ones, like teaching the children and so on, right? You can estimate this by finding out what are the wages per hour of a kindergarten teacher. Right? So means you are going for a hybrid. So one is by generalist made plus the specialized function, which is missing from the first part. So you can use the garden wages. And the planning and budgeting, you can look at manpower statistics. They have what the a manager earns from a very tiny small firm of between 4 to 6. So you can imagine the manager manages a staff of 4 to 6 people. The manpower statistics gives you that wages per hour. Then you can use that equivalent to the homemaking activity, which is missing from the replacement cost by maid. So you add these two. So it's a hybrid. So I'm using both variations, right? Both variations of the replacement cost. And it's called the hybrid model in the literature. And then I say, however, maids maids being a replacement worker, the the efficiency is different. It's different between the maid and the homemaker. In the case of Singapore, we get a lot of maids from Indonesia, Philippines, and so on. These maids are used to homemaking activities in back in their own country. So they're quite used to washing, cleaning, and so on. And Singapore women tend to be not as equivalent to them in terms of how fast they finish the task of cooking, cleaning, washing. The survey found that yes, the Singapore homemakers are less efficient compared to the maids. So how do you calculate? You just have to find out, all right, how much the same number of hours is done by the maids, right? How much it would be done by the household themselves. So this gives you an idea. It's called efficiency adjusted. What it means is that if you use the wage rates of a maid to replace that of homemaker, you would be overestimating the value of homemaking by a local homemaker. And you have to adjust it by this efficiency factor. The third method is called opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is quite clear. This means that if the homemaker stays at home, homemaker gives up things which jobs, whatever, the homemaker could have done outside the home. And if he does outside the home, the homemaker would have been paid so much, right? But now he stays at home. So there's an opportunity cost. We call it opportunity cost of this being home. So the opportunity cost method just simply finds out how much the, the value of the time that the homemaker spends at home when he could have done something outside earning income. So he gives up the income to work at home. So the value of the work at home must exceed the value of the income which she could have got outside. That's why she's not working outside, she works at home, right? Now that's the problem with this method. This method measures not the output, but rather the input. The time is the input, right? Compared to the other methods, just mostly the output. So in this case, we may conclude that a medical doctor stays at home as a housewife. The value she produces in the home production is greater than a teacher or a clerk who also stays at home. But it may not be so. The value of the home production produces by the non-medical doctor may even be higher than the medical doctor's own household production service. Just because of opportunity cost, the wages that the medical doctor could earn compared to the wages that a teacher or a clerk could earn. So therefore, the opportunity cost method would then value this kind of homemaking differently by different occupation. And that's, to some people, is not correct. And of course, the other problem about opportunity cost is that you're assuming that people can just choose how many hours they want to work outside, right? Because you're comparing between homemaking and market work. But market work, you have to take a certain lumpiness. You work 8 hours per day, or you don't work at all. Or you work part-time 4 hours. There's no such thing as I will decide I work 6 hours. But opportunity cost method implies that you're doing this kind of comparisons, right? Now, the fourth method, which I developed also, is called the contingent valuation method. And in um, this method is consistent with the way economists put values on goods and services. So what it does is this: we ask the homemaker, okay, you are doing 8 hours of work a week. We'll take 2 hours away from you. How much, and replace it with a maid? How much would you be willing to pay for this service? Right? And then I take away another 2 hours from you, from 8 to 6, 6 to 4. I ask the same question. The idea is to trace out the willing to pay for different clumps of hours. And if you do that, you may get a demand curve for housework. Okay. And the way economists do when they talk about valuation is to calculate the area under that area and demand curve will tell you the value of homemaking. Similar to any market good. If you can get the demand curve for anything, you calculate the area curve, that's the value of your thing. So we are doing it the same way. So that's called the. I don't have to be in detail here. Just get you grasp the overall idea. And here I present some literature review. First, beginning with older literature, right? And this one talks about the methodology, the country where the study took place, and how much is the average annual value per house in US dollars, and the value of household production as a percentage of the GNP. So these are older literature. You can see 28% GNP, 25%, some even 45%, some 37%, right? Depending on the methods they use for valuation. The OC is the opportunity cost, the RC is the replacement cost. Philippines, Japan, India, and my own study in Singapore. So Singapore is the lowest, 5% of the GN, but it's actually quite absolute number is actually quite big. The more recent literature, which we can find, you see, it can be as low as 22% all the way to 61%, in India. But not surprising also, because India a lot of production. Most there are huge section which stays at home and do the work. And so in this case, uh, you can expect that the homemaking sector in India must be quite big. So the computation is 61%, right, of the GDP in India based on replacement cost method. So anyway, my slides are available to anyone who wants it. Just get from the Penang Institute. As long as you quote where the slides come from, I'm fine with it. So there's no need to take out in the slide to understand, but I cannot go in detail with everything on the slide. So these are some more studies. See, in Malaysia, 48% and 49%, depending on the time method. That's quite big. And this is telling you that the value of unpaid work relative to GDP. Albania seems quite high. Again, Albania is like India. Lots of home people stay at home and contribute. And You can understand like Japan, Korea, all smaller. Maybe people are career women, they are mostly in the market rather than staying at home. Of course, also depends on the GDP, how big the GDP, because relative to the GDP. This is IMF study. Um, so in this graph just tells you that in studies involving developed countries, the value of the non-market labor obtained by opportunity cost method is usually higher than the replacement cost method. That's all it tells you. The two methods compared by countries. Now, this is an interesting slide which we managed to find from the UK or US, UK, okay, UK. You can even do it yourself. You know, you have this on top. They have the replacement cost methods, the output method, and so on and so forth. And so all you need to do is input how many hours you spend in each of these activities. Then you multiply by the respective wages which is given in the report to you. Then you just compute your value. Anyone is interested, but it's a British study, right? British study. But you can duplicate it for a Malaysian study using the local wages and so on and so forth, and encouraging people to just put in your hours into the respective category, then you just multiply by the respective wages found in each of these categories. Then you add them all up, and then you get the value. Some people do it for fun, just to know. This is more of the time use value for housework. This is from time use surveys, in detail surveys, how much hours it's spent, and so on and so forth. And then there are more recent literature that looks at household production in relation to household income inequality and also household composition. This one uses a real-time online platform rather than looking at what would be the wage rate and what are the wages from a pot book. This one is go into the online platform. They'll tell you immediately real-time data how much the wages earned by different occupation. So you can just use those numbers instead of looking through the report book and the annual book. This is supposed to be more up to date. So it's a new thing, but the methods remain the same. It's just that how you collect the data, right, is different. That's all. Okay. Then there's another interesting thing we found by the Kazana Research Institute of Malaysia, right? And they had this report on gender inequality, unpaid care work, and time use survey, where they covered home production, poverty, and inequality. And they actually used the replacement cost methods of two variations. And they found the value of household production is about 2,960 ringgit per capita, means per person per month. And they argue that household production has an important role as a buffer against income inequality. And women are showing more unpaid work compared to men, despite working almost equal. So in the report, they go through in detail based on the survey they had done on what kind of time allocation between men and women and how much that works out in terms of replacement cost methods of two variations. And then there's this concept that the Kazana Research Institute talks about time poverty. Time poverty is not like income poverty, not enough income, it's not enough time. Meaning that they computed how much time do especially women spend on working life and also working housework and all these things. They have very little time for themselves, for anything, for leisure and so on. So it's a time poverty. They try to impute a money value to the time deficits by using the minimum wage rate. This is all from the Kazana Research Institute's report. So again, women seems to be affected the most. They have higher poverty rate compared to men across all income classes and so on and so forth. I won't go in detail, but if you have time, take a look at these numbers. Quite interesting. Now then, the I think almost the last part, who should pay? We always talk about homemaking deserves recognition and so on. Then what are you going to do about it? That's the question. So should husband pay the wife if the wife do all the housework, right? So that I hear some yes here. Okay, now the problem with the husband paying the wife is that number one, some already paid in the form of income, and some in the form of pocket money. Let's not talk about how much they pay, but I'm just saying there's some form of compensation already between the husband and the wife. Always how the wife exists. You surely must have some pocket money, and sometimes the husband takes the wife to vacation, eat out, and so on and so forth. So part of it. The second thing, it is much more, I think, more difficult, is that in a marriage, it's supposed to be love between the respective spouses. To force them into a market transaction is then there's not marriage, right? So that's a problem, challenge. My wife is here, by the way. Now the second argument is that when the homemaker, in this case the wife, is very good, very dedicated to the family, takes good care of the family, then the husband becomes more productive outside. So when the husband goes to work, he feels happy, and by being happy, he will be more hardworking and more focused on his market work. And so he benefits the employer. So the second argument says the employer should pay the wife. But the problem with that argument is that if the husband is more productive in his work outside, the husband gets already rewarded by the employer through bonus performance, through promotion, right? So it's already rewarded in that way. So by forcing the employer to pay the wife in addition to these things, it'll be like double counting. So the logic is there. Now the third one, which I think deserves attention, is that if the homemaker takes good care of the family in producing home goods and also discipline children, then the children and the family would function as a family unit, and they would in turn the children contribute well to the economy. So in other words, a good homemaker produces a functional family, not dysfunctional family. If you have a homemaker that don't care everything, then that family will disintegrate and become dysfunctional. And that becomes a burden for the state, therefore for society. So we want to encourage good homemakers, right, in their homemaking activities to produce good functional families for the society. So in other words, we are saying the homemaking activity produces such things, and therefore it doesn't just benefit the household, their own family, but it benefits the larger society if they do it right? And so there's what we call a positive spillover effect. And so society as a whole benefit from this positive spillover effect, and society therefore ought to encourage more of such good dedicated homemakers. And so there's an argument that society should take up some of this payment. So here is and how we should pay, and some of the social media questions, and we provided some of the answers to the social media questions. And this goes to what I was saying earlier. So some quick concluding comments from this. There is no one definition of household production for all users, and the appropriate definition of household production and the housework methodology adopted depends on what is the objective measurement. If you want it for GDP, then use market valuation. So you try to approximate the market valuation, right? That means you are defining household production activities as those that are market replaceable. You cannot go and use a definition of household production that includes a lot of non-replaceable because you just cannot get the market prices for that. So you have to be consistent with the way they measure the GDP, and so you get a partial accounting for home production. Now, for matrimonial property settlements, as in compensation cases of law tort and so on, then it's based on the welfare kind of consideration. And here has to be more inclusive and includes replacement costs and also opportunity costs to calculate these values. It's not just based on just replacement costs. The disparities found in measures of value of housework across different studies must take into account definition, quantification, treatment of joint production or multitasking, and methods of evaluation depends very much on the objective of evaluation. Now, while the value of household production is indeed very useful and important for many users, but by no means do we require it to be incorporated into the GNP directly. Because we know the GNP is much more established measure. They are based on some consistent indicators, and they can use it across comparisons across countries. When you put it in housework, we have yet to decide what should be the appropriate definition, what should be the definition, meaning how do we deal multitasking, how do we deal with many of these issues, and then which method to use. So we have to agree first before we can incorporate into the GNP. But we can have a separate accounting, a sort of augmentation, right, to the GNP. And for that, we need a regular survey of time use, detailed time use, So it's no use to just, to me, no use asking homemakers and say, how many hours you spend on cooking? I think you need proper time use studies method. It means you provide a schedule. In the schedule, the homemakers will then tell you, or whenever the homemakers does some cooking, you go and click on the time that they spend, and then a researcher can then complete all this time across many types of households. You just can't ask homemaker, do you remember how many hours you do cooking? To me, that's all not very accurate, right? So monetary estimates on the value of housework should be compiled periodically and weigh against all the economic growth statistics and so on and so forth. And it should be made available to all the judicial institutions, the courts and the law to use for appropriate compensation and division of matrimonial assets. Okay, this is some itemization of what we need to do to further the research. Okay, I'll skip all this. It's about tax treatment. Okay, those of you I don't know in the audience who are interested in such things, I've compiled references for you to look at in this literature, quite detailed. On the house of production. And these are my own work going back a long time. And I have a recent one coming out on value of women's work in the home. How can we make care count in the national budget? So this is the book that I was talking about here on the. So this book contains the very detailed account on the history, on the methodology, on the estimates for household production. And this is the book that was selected for the critical writings in economics in UK. Okay, I think I'm to now to spend time to take comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Prof. Quah, for the very insightful and interesting lecture that you just gave us. So before I open the floor, open questions to the floor, I would like to make use of my moderators, right, to ask you one question first. So we talked about resistance to actually measuring household production. So I think one of the arguments is that some has argued that quantifying household production would actually have the unintended consequences of perpetuating existing inequalities, such as reinforcing gender stereotypes or even basically widening the economic inequalities in terms of like if you monetize core household work based on quantification, it could actually benefit those who can afford it, basically widening the economic and marginalizing those who cannot, for example, single mothers or low-income families. So what are your thoughts on that kind of criticism against measuring household production?
Well, in terms of measuring, what is the purpose of measuring and valuing household production? So I said before, it can use for many purposes. And one important use for your own use to make informed choices as to what is your contribution if you spend your time at home versus if you spend it in the market earning paid income, right? So if you can do such measurements of paid work, what is it worth? And compared to paid work, what is it worth? It sort of guides you to make the right choices, which is more valuable to you and the family. So I think it's useful to incorporate such methods. It's not meant to correct gender biases. But gender biases is always there. You know how it is that when you are young, or your parents, your family, right? When it comes to housework activities, you will say, "Oh, the son go, the daughter come and work and help mommy in the kitchen." So the result is always perpetuating this gender bias over time, right? And it's hard to change. It's a big challenge for even state intervention. You want the state to come in and compel role reversals and so on. But it's for maybe for education, maybe education to tell that perhaps this reinforcement of gender roles may not be so good for the future of society, and therefore we want some sort of equivalent contribution from the men. And to do that, one must start from the early childhood and get both the sons and the daughters to help out in homework, in home production activity. Rather than in most families, I see the boys often spend doing the housework, but the women, the daughters are usually asked to help out with the parents in housework. So this is a kind of a gender biases that reinforces over time. And so I think the state must come in, not to compel, but to educate, right, about this gender bias, right? The second thing is that there's always a wage discrimination in the market between men and women. So in any country, if you look at most countries, Singapore included, of course, that there is a wage gap between men and women's earnings. And that wage gap works against women. And therefore, it's not surprising that quite a number of women stays at home compared uh, to men. So that's so the state intervention here is that where the wage gap, where there's a difference in the wage gap, and that's not accounted by, say, demand and supply issues, if it's not accounted for, or because of some biases, then that's where the government or the state intervention comes in to try to narrow this wage gap, right, through new policies to try to influence the wage gap. And I think the third point of state intervention is that I think there should be certain campaigns with the help of other organizations that men doing housework is no issue. It's not an inferior issue. Sometimes what's wrong with house husband? Nothing wrong. All it depends on is the valuation of the contribution, right? That's why in the theory of the family, right, it's a combination. marriage, right? Who contributes more at home? Who contributes outside? Depends upon the the value that each spouse brings, either from paid work or unpaid. So the campaigns to try to lessen this gender bias, right, and encourage more men. If their worth is more at home, why not be at home, right? A clear example would be maybe a woman that can earn more money in the market compared to the men. There's nothing wrong. I actually have a classmate. I have a classmate uh, that actually house husband spends all his time contributing to the home production, and the actually works in the market, fetching him big income. It's a good combination. So it's not necessary that you must hold the idea, I'm a man, therefore I work, and you're a woman, you stay at home. So I think if this kind of uh, biases can be dispelled over time, that would be good.
Thank you, Prof. Quah. So now I'm going to open the floor to questions. So I think we'll take 2 questions for the first round. Please state your name, your organization if you're representing one, and please keep your questions short to the point.
You cannot make comment.
Yeah, yes.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Pei Jung. Good afternoon, Prof. Quah. My name is Karen Lai, and I am from the Women's Center for Change. I'm not an economist, merely a feminist. I know that I probably won't be able to change the gender wage gap in my lifetime, but I'd like to die trying. Thank you for your comprehensive presentation. I think there is a lot to unpack. Allow me to make 3 points quickly, exceeding the 2 allocated. I think the problem lies in the nature of marriage, work, family, and so on. I think the idea of wife's contribution is premised on the idea that it has based on marriage, which is again, some argue a patriarchal concept. Yeah, so there are lots of things going on. Care work is not confined to a relationship marriage. Care work is very broad, very challenging. And the problem with care work is if you value it according to standards out there in the market, it is already seriously undervalued. We know for a fact that the bulk of domestic work, which is seen as care work, is performed by women. Women who are primarily migrants, domestic workers, oppressed in multiple forms. So that's already a definitional issue. Care of the elderly as well. You know, you need not be in the same home as the elderly. Be caring for them outside those hours. Which brings me to the point that when you're looking at opportunity costs, it includes the opportunity to take good care of your physical and mental health. Often the care work is mental or emotional in nature. You may not be there physically with the person, but you're constantly worried about it. And I think if a stone in the sky, ask any woman, she may not be physically there, she may be out in the office. But if a family member is sick, a child is sick, I guarantee you, okay, 90% of her mind will be on that and not out there in the market. So how do we cover that? Last but not least, I want to point out that the Malaysian government acceded to the CEDAW Women's Convention or the elimination of discrimination or all forms of violence against, all forms of discrimination against women. Article 5 clearly stipulates that the government is under obligation to eliminate gender norms and stereotypes. So not only is the state, the state has willingly acceded to that. So it's not a matter of whether or not the state should intervene. The state is under legal, moral, and human rights obligations to do so. Thank you.
Okay, I think I can just briefly comment.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, thank you very much for comments, which are, of course, of serious concerns, and we acknowledge that. When we talk about state interventions, I'm talking about what kind of applications relevant. What can the state actually do? Even though you talk about they have to sign up everything, that's fine. So the next stage is then what do they do after they have signed up? And these are difficult challenges to think of some solutions, especially when you deal with gender biases, because they tend to become so entrenched over time. How do you disentangle it is a big question. We cannot use, as I said, mandatory laws to disentangle. This won't work. What can we do? So this is also a future research direction that perhaps we should spend more time on it. Um, the oppression, of course, is related to this to the feminist literature you're talking about, and is true in some of the the migrants, the lower educated income classes, where they have less opportunities compared to the upper income classes, higher educated classes. In the old days, where you tend to see less divorce and so on. Why? Because the women at that time is less market opportunities. It's only over time that they become more educated and they can command prices in the market. They can walk away from a marriage, so they have more bargaining power compared to those lower educated classes and lower income classes. Um, and so this oppression primarily deals, I think, with the lower educated, lower income classes. The other comments you made, I mean, I take all your point here. And said this is when you deal with, I'm only dealing with the aspect that I would like to recognize women's role at home, and not just women's contribution in the marketplace. I think women does important social functions at home, and not just contributing to the family with benefits, but also contributing indirectly to society. And therefore, society should recognize this work done by these homemakers and not just lip service. But how do you therefore recognize them in what way, right? So I talk about compensation issues, who should compensate, and I talk about how do you value, how do you measure. I think these are important prerequisites to recognition. Okay.
I think Karen has one more question about how do we actually account for the opportunity cost of mental and physical health?
Yeah.
Is
So
that actually
yeah,
doable?
sure. When we talk about opportunity cost of time, it's only basically comparing between market work and non-market work, what you give up in home rather than in the marketplace. So usually it's just the wages for one. Now you carry that forward by talking about also maybe a more calm mind, a better mental mind compared to home when you're stressed out, right, with the demands of the whole place. And yes, there is an opportunity cost here in terms of the mental distress by being at home rather than being in the marketplace. But this is where uh, economists don't contribute in that sector. Psychiatrists, psychologists do. But what economists can do is to figure out what, number one, try to measure what is this. Uh, when a person lost, um, when a person has more mental stress because of working at home, okay, what does that lead to in terms of changing, maybe have medical ailments and so on. If we can translate this into a list of the costs, right, as to what this mental stress comes to the homemaker, we can then value each of these things as well. So that's where economists can come in, but directly they don't come in. So we wait for the psychologists, psychiatrists to pick up this important comment that you have made.
Thanks, Prof. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Hello, I'm Mr. Teo. Yeah, I just wonder how can you evaluate a homemaker or full-time housewife when she's 7 days, 365 days a week, 24 hours a day? How can you evaluate that? That's all.
Yeah, so I said we use a time use surveys to find out what she does, right? And what she does is cooking, washing, cleaning, taking care of children, taking care of husband, taking care of old people. All these things you can try to find out how much time that she allocated to take care of these people, right? That's one. And find out if you replace all this with an outsider, right? How much will it cost? Because if you lose all this, you still got to find ways to replace the homemaker. So what it would cost to replace homemaker? 365 days a year, as you put it. And that is through those methods that I just discussed. It's not perfect. There are a lot of things that are still missing from there, but at least we get quite a close approximation.
Do not sincerely evaluate what a woman gives to the family.
Yeah. So if that's
Society.
sure. But I mean, The problem is if you don't try to measure and evaluate, then you just take it as for granted, you know. You're back to the old thing, the status quo. That's all. It means the appreciation for women will not be as higher, and recognition won't be there, compensation won't be there. So it's just, I mean, we all know there are a lot of things which a homemaker does for the family, but not all is accountable. But we try to at least raise awareness of this contribution. That's what we are trying to do. We are not trying to establish accuracy here.
Variation, those variations are very case of variation.
Of course.
In the general daily courses, you cannot evaluate what the woman gave. When it's 24 hours, you know, when you work, you have a number of hours you need to. And then you have holidays. You have rights to rest Saturday, Sunday. But the woman doesn't have that. I'm sorry. If you have a kid of 3 years old or a father-in-law of 77 years old, you do not have that at all. Thank you.
Well, I agree with you that not everything that can be measured and valued, everything that the homemaker does for the family. But I still think that we need to do something, not just simply say, okay, they're very valuable, and then everybody just happily go away and nothing happens, right? So as you put it yourself, in any case where there's a divorce, there's wrongful death, right? We must put a value for these things. If you don't do anything, then nobody can value anything.
Thank you very much, Prof. Quah and Pei-Jung for the moderation. Um, this part about the economy, I think this is actually a fantastic move because if we actually work with communities and all that. And one of the questions that normally comes out is that, hey, you are not working, especially to the homemaker, to the wives most of the time. So it is like it actually can perpetuate to even domestic violence because we are talking about power play in cases like this. So not having a value of, I don't know, it can be the 2000 from Kazana or whatever. If you're able to bring it out and tell even the husband and say, hey, your the contribution of your wife is this X dollar. It gives meaning and it becomes tangible. Rather than saying, lah, you contribute, itu saja, you serve the family, I also serve the family. But then when it talks about power dynamic, you find that the one who bring in the money is the one who have a bigger say. So I really appreciate and I think that we should be looking forward maybe enhancing or even refining some of the models that we could actually use it even in Malaysia. So, Prof, is there any way that you could, come in to Malaysia, come back and serve Penang, even for that matter? Yeah, start off with Penang. I think Penang have enough data for us to even start for a state, and see how we can move forward. And that becomes the spin-off, for the nation. If we cannot do it for all, let's start with people. And I really appreciate if we can do something about it so that I also can go out and say, hey, actually contribute this X dollar. Don't look yourself so down and, say, because most of the time when you ask homemaker, who is working? Homemaker never put up their hand on. It's only those who are really working as in productive as in, working outside. So when I ask, what do you do? What time we wake up and all that? Then look into how much time they spend. And those are just working hours. You can imagine the number of working hours. So, yeah, well, please come back to Penang and serve Penang. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Bilang from Penang Women's Development Corporation. It's a state GLC. Thank you.
Prof, do you have a response to that?
I think what you say is very relevant, of course. And I've encountered a lot of instances. You ask people, so what are you doing? Oh, I'm not working. It's totally not true. You are working and you're contributing, if not even as much as the paid worker. So the methods that I talked about earlier is a well-established method. It's a question of getting the time use survey done. Without the time use surveys, as I said earlier too, if you just based on recall, then people will just reject it, right? So you have to get proper time use surveys and then regularly update these time use surveys. So you get an idea of the contribution of time that the homemaker does, and then you apply one of those especially the replacement cost by various variants to try to value the homemaking effort. And then the third thing you should do is to encourage the state. And I think this one Aziza comes up with this scheme, which I thought is quite good because it serves as a first step into recognition of homemaking. Although the numbers that they generated is still small, the value 600 is pretty low, but they tell I think the man's spouse to contribute up to 100, 120 to the wife, even though that's little uh, per month or something. Very low. But so they have to work at it since they got the framework up. They have to work at it to raise this value, proper value accounting through one of the existing methods that I talked about. But it's a step in the right direction.
We have a question from one gentleman at the back and then Dato' Rohana in front.
Thanks, Prof. Quah. My question goes about work-life balance. So as an employer who provides the husband now with better work-life balance initiative, how does this influence the value of homemaker? Does it increase it or decrease the value of a homemaker? When the employer provides better work-life balance initiatives to the husband.
To the husband. What you're saying is that the employer encourages the husband to have more work-life balance. So what it means is that probably the husband will now spend more time with the wife at home, maybe. And so by spending more time at home, then they'll probably do things together at home. That would raise the value of their home production at home. I think that's what the work-life balance means. Yeah.
Because an alternative is also as a substitute, you see. Then now the husband cleans and does the gardening while the wife takes some off. So will that reduce? Because I'm just off my mind, I'm confused whether will it increase or decrease, you see.
It should if the husband were to spend the time at home with the wife, it should increase the value and not decrease. Because the work-life balance means to spend more time with the family and spend more time, right? With to raise your own health, happiness, and so on.
Thank you.
Dato' Rohana? Front here.
Thank you, Pei Jung. Thank you, Prof. I think here I would like to invite you to share some ways of handling this. So, the most vulnerable age of moving into poverty has been said are the women. At the age of 60, many of these women then move into this because they have no support system. There's no pension scheme, and so on. So I'm Rohana, and I am involved with the Penang Investment Corporation. So we pursue to advocate for women, the recognition of women's contribution to the family, same as the recognition given to the men when they go to work, or women when they work in the marketplace. So it can be men or women who stays home and do the production. And how do you then also enable these people to have the same type of system, like you have a pension scheme, you have insurance program, you have all these other parts, in which then one can say that it is equal, that you go out from the family to do market work, or you stay in the family to do home production work. So can you share with us some of the practices in other countries that enable women to be as secure, those people who stay at home to be as secure in terms of financial and their health situation when they reach this age?
Dato', I'm sorry to disappoint you because I'm only dealing with the measurements of values of household production. I think your question is much more broader, much more deeper involving this subject you just talked about, how to make them equalize between contributions, the paid market work and the non-market
Yeah,
work.
because I see that as the impact of measuring then, no? So you measure all these things, the value of this, but for what? So for me, it is then to enable those who stay home and do this work to have the same security support system.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I thought that maybe
Yes.
if you could share in practices in some countries, how have they gone about it?
Yeah, the only thing I know is that in Canada, for example, they have a payment into the social security system. Right? So I think most countries will just have this kind of contribution, set aside some contribution.
Mandatory insurance coverage?
That one, I don't think they have mandatory insurance coverage. But the important point is that you do this measurement evaluation for what? Is for all these purposes that I just mentioned, right? Now, outside of these purposes, the next thing is to build esteem on the part of the homemaker. I've done work, real work, and this work is of value to my family and also to society. So these measures would establish to give them that self-esteem. They can at least cope some of the major works that are done. And the third thing is that then how do you reward them? That comes in your insurance scheme, the government state's contribution, the social security scheme. All this is the third part that comes in. But all start from the first part, which is time use valuation and measuring and valuing housing production. You have to start from somewhere. Then the next thing will follow. It's no point in going to shout to the world. They demand more recognition and so on, and you don't know what is the recognition. And if you just shout a simple number you shout out, then they will say, "Oh no, you've never done any study, never proper." So you have to do all these proper studies to develop this argument.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So I think we have it's 5:30 now. So we are at the end of our talk with Prof. Quah. Prof. Quah, before we close, any concluding thoughts?
Including talk. Well, yeah. Including talk is to thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much again. Thanks again, Prof. Quah, for your time and your knowledge and expertise
Thank
today
you.
shared with
Thank
us.
you.
And thank you, everyone, for being part of our audience. So we hope to see you again at the next talk hosted by the Penang Institute. Thanks, everyone.